Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Book Cafe. Today we are interviewing John Joseph Adams, the editor of Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines. Multiple Hugo Award, or was it Nebula?
Yeah, Hugo.
Multiple Hugo Award winning, and he's currently the editor of the John Joseph Adams Imprint at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. So, hello, nice to meet
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Glad you could make it.
Yeah, good to be here.
Um, so let's start with some career questions. Start at the beginning, I suppose. Did you always want to work with books? It mentioned you started working with at a bookstore, Walden, where you
Mhm.
sold books.
Right.
And now you have your own book, Imprint. Was that
Mhm.
always? Did you always see yourself interested in publishing? Was that always the direction you wanted to take?
Yeah, no, not at all. I even actually kind of came to voracious reading kind of late. It seems like most writers and editors that you run into, they've been voracious readers their whole life. And whereas with me, I'd always been a reader. I'd always had a book that I was reading, but I was never really voracious about it until I got the job at the bookstore. And then I sort of realized how many great books there were out there that I had no idea that there were books like that. Just like in terms of like the wide variety of things that exist in all the different categories. And so partially because I wanted to do a good job at the bookstore, and partially just because I was so fascinated by all the different books that I was reading the descriptions of and everything, I started just reading really voraciously, and I was basically reading like a book every day. And like a couple times I read more than one book in a day. One day I read 3 books in a day, and I felt very proud of that.
That
I
is
didn't get
very
much else
impressive.
done, needless to say. Um, but so I did that, and then I also got the writing bug, and so I started writing. And this was around when I was like 18 or so. So I basically thought I was going to be a writer at a certain point, and so I was pursuing that. And then so in college I studied creative writing and such, and there is where I sort of discovered that maybe I had some ability at editing. When I was doing critiques and stuff, like my professors thought I was doing a good job with that kind of thing, and it was all sort of just it was all sort of what I imagine as kind of like a side hustle as I continued to pursue writing. I thought like, oh well, hey, apparently you can't really expect to just be a writer. You have to have a job, that you work at the same time. And so I thought, well, what would be a better job than being an editor while you're trying to be a writer? And I had seen like some other people had done things like that. I discovered like Ben Bova is one of my early science fiction discoveries. And of course he was the editor of Analog for many years, and a very notable writer in his own right. So it's like the idea got in my head, like, oh well, I could be an editor, and as I continued to pursue writing. So after college, I got a job in science fiction. Um, yeah, and then so things got started from there. I never really thought that I would end up having my own imprint at a novel publisher or anything like that. Especially since once I got into publishing, I spent 15 years or so just working in short fiction, which is very divorced from book publishing. It's like you have some intersections when you do an anthology or something. You get some sort of sense of like how book publishing works, but even when I was working at FNSF, at a certain point, it was always a part-time job. So at various points in my career there, I thought like, oh well, I should look around and see if like maybe I could get a job at one of the book publishers, because it would be a more stable job. It would have better future career prospects because at FNSF it's like it was a very small operation, even though the magazine's a very big deal in the field. But like Gordon Van Gelder was my boss. He was the editor and publisher. He was like the only person above me. So it's like, well, unless he was going to fire himself, I wasn't going to get the job. And so it's like if I was going to move up and on in my career, I'd have to look elsewhere. It was after I already left. So, I had looked around at some book publishers to maybe get a job at one of those, and the I don't know. I couldn't even get past like human resources. Like I'd send in an application and stuff, and like they didn't care. It seemed like to me. I mean, like that was the. I mean, I got no responses, so it's like, well, what other conclusion could I come to then that I didn't care about that experience that I had working at FNSF? So, and I mean, that was even a couple times I applied for just like an entry level job, like an editorial assistant job, which would have felt probably like a step down to me. I mean, it probably would have had to do a lot more sort of administrative type tasks, whereas at FNSF I was actually editing, But yeah, anyway, given all that, and I settled into this career as a short fiction editor, and I sort of stopped even thinking about ever working in novel publishing because, I mean, eventually, I was living in New Jersey, and so I could have gotten a job back then. But then, I met my wife at a convention, and then we started seeing each other long distance, and eventually I moved to California to be with her. So once I moved here, I was like, okay, well, I'm definitely never going to work in publishing now, and beyond just editing short fiction. But then, yeah, the opportunity came along anyway. Even though, I guess maybe it's like once you stop thinking about something, it's like that's actually when it might happen or something. Doesn't always work out that way, but for me, it did, I guess.
I guess we come back to that question later. For now, you said you were interested in writing. You did a creative writing major.
Right.
Was that before or after you started getting back into science fiction?
Oh, yeah, it was after, yeah, so, I mean, basically, anything I ever wrote was science fiction, so it was after I was already interested in science fiction.
So basically, when I was about
like 15 or so, or maybe a couple of years before, I mean, it's kind of hard to say to pinpoint, it's like at a certain point I realized that everything that I really loved was science fiction or fantasy. And looking back on, and so at that point, I kind of identified as a fan of those genres. Whereas before, that's really all I consumed, but I never really knew that, oh yeah, no, that's what I am. I'm a science fiction fantasy fan. I never had that identification. So, my sister used to work at a B. Dalton, and so she used to bring me books, and so she was kind of my dealer. She would bring me books. She would basically be my curator. And so I never really knew, all the great books that I love, they come from this one to read. But I never really, I didn't. It took me a long time to do that. And then so when I was like in my teens, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and so I was really into that. And then I was watching like Star Trek Next Generation, and then like I sort of rediscovered Star Wars around that time when I started really getting into all the different kinds of science fiction and understanding that that's where my love lay, and so yeah, it's like and over the course of those years, I slowly started reading some science fiction and trying to really develop that. I mean, I guess it was a couple of years after that where I really started getting serious about it. I mean, it's like, it was sort of a slow progression. It's like it started with D&D, so I'm thinking about all that a lot. And that's kind of where the creative drive to write came from. Cause, I tried to Dungeon Master a campaign, and it was a little bit too difficult for me to do everything on the fly. And so I thought maybe I could try writing something, because then it's like I can control all the details. I don't have players interfering with my schemes. I can control everything. But so I had that impetus, and then yeah, it wasn't really until I started working at the bookstore that I really found the science fiction section and started delving into there, because I took this detour through like medical thrillers and stuff. Like my sister again had bought me some like Robin Cook novels, and he writes all like these medical thrillers, and I really got into those, and so I sort of transitioned from that to Michael Crichton, and then Michael Crichton opened up all the doors for me to get into science fiction. Because I had this funny idea that I wouldn't really, once I understood like, oh well, like all this awesome stuff seems to be in the science fiction section, but I was like, at first I was like, I don't know that I'll be able to understand any of that. Like I thought like, oh well, it's going to be like a lot of, it's going to be almost like a technical manual, a level of detail, but for technologies that don't exist. And so I was like, I'm not going to be able to understand that. Like, I mean, I dropped out of high school, and at that time, like, I'd gotten my GED, and I hadn't gone back to college yet, so I just, basically dropped out at 16, got my GED. I'm working at a bookstore, I hadn't gone to college or anything, and so I was like, I don't know, I didn't have too high an opinion of what I was capable of in terms of absorbing that level of information or whatever, and so I was sort of intimidated by what I thought science fiction was. But of course, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's like, and fortunately, my sister's husband at the time pointed out to me. It's like, well, if you can handle the science in Jurassic Park, you can handle the science in any science fiction book. It's like, I mean, Jurassic Park has more science than probably like 75% of science fiction novels. I mean, it's like hardcore, like so much science. So yeah, I mean, that's I guess that's how I got there. Basically, it's like, eventually, Michael Crichton opened up all the doors for me there.
And I do you have any idea where you got where that impression came from, that it would be technical? Because you said you used to read it when you were younger, and I'm just, it's
right. Well, I mean, the stuff that I read when I was younger, I guess it was mostly fantasy. Like, I read a lot of Piers Anthony, and I read like Robert Asprin, the Myth series, which in retrospect is like, well, that's probably why I'm so fond of puns these days. It's like I grew up with pun, fantasy as my primary go-to reading material, for all those years. But I mean, I read things like A Wrinkle in Time and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I when I was younger, like, yeah, all the reading that I did, I guess, was fantasy. And so I would watch Star Trek, and I loved Star Trek. But then I guess I imagined that it was probably Star Trek's fault, really, in a sense, that made me think that the science fiction novels would be too complex, because I would think of like all the technobabble they would say on Star Trek, and I would think like, well, in book form it's going to be too much, and it's going to be even more detailed. And so, I mean, of course, then later I learned, like, on Star Trek, at least on Next Generation, it's like they would actually like write the plots, and then they would kind of go back and backfill a lot of the technobabble stuff where it's like it doesn't make any sense. It's like it's like it makes a certain amount of sense within the context of like the Star Trek milieu and everything, but it's like a lot of it's just like kind of gibberish. It's like, well, it's like, okay, yeah, those terms sound cool together, and like, okay, you can kind of follow that, but it's not like realistically like thought out like 100%. I mean, I think science fiction books tend to be a little bit more rigorous, in terms of like all the different world building things and being consistent and all that kind of stuff. But I guess I had that weird impression that it was going to be much more dense and everything. Like, and I mean, I really don't know why I thought that, because I can't think of any like example where like I tried to read some science fiction novel and it was just too hard for me. And then that I thought that all books would be like that. I can't think of any example that was like that. Yeah, because like I think like the first like real science fiction novel I read, like, that's in the science fiction section and was like hard SF, I think was just Mars by Ben Bova. And I mean, that's got tons of science in it. I mean, like I said, he was the editor of Analogs, so I mean, he's like definitely all about like realistic hard SF stuff. And I mean, that was very easy to follow, and it was really good, accessible stuff. So, like I think like if I was that 18-year-old kid and I picked up like a Charles Stross novel or something, like, I don't know, I might have got scared away by that. It's like even after I was working at FNSF, and Charles Stross was first sort of emerging in Asimov's and everything. I know it took me a while to like sort of to sort of penetrate what he was doing. It was like I first tried reading a couple of the stories, and I know I found them difficult at first, and then eventually I feel like, I don't know, I leveled up my science fiction reading enough that I was like, okay, now I can actually grapple with this. But like if I tried to get it if I was trying to read it when I was 18 or something, I don't know that I would have made any sense of it. So yeah, I don't know. It's a weird thing, and in a lot of ways, it's very strange that I ever became an editor, given all this weird journey I took to get here, But
I mean, but that does mean that there's a lot of questions to ask about it, right?
Yeah.
So you've mentioned that one of your very formative works was Alfred Bester's "The Stars My Destination."
Yeah.
Use your exact words. It blew your mind.
Yeah.
What was so different about that book?
Well, it was. I think it was a combination of a lot of things. I mean, first of all, I sort of discovered it completely by random. I was working at the bookstore. It had been out of print for a long time, and Vintage just re-released this new edition of it. And my store was a pretty small one, and so we didn't actually get it in the store. But at the time, this was like before Amazon, or at least before it was big, and so people would still come into the bookstore and they would special order a book if you didn't have it. And so people kept ordering that to the extent that I was curious about it, because I was like, why do people keep ordering this? Because I'm looking at it, it's like, this looks cool. I mean, although the cover isn't obviously a genre book, it's like, once you read the back of it and everything, and like you kind of understand what the book's about, it's like, okay, yeah, the cover kind of makes sense, but it's not like obviously a genre cover. There's not like a spaceship on it or anything, So I read the back and I was like, wow, this sounds really cool. And I was like asking, my brother-in-law at the time was like, hey, do you know who this is or anything about this? And he didn't know Bester. And he was like my sort of go-to guide to who knew science fiction and fantasy pretty well. And so like, he would recommend things to me once I was, trying to try new things and everything. But so I just decided, okay, I'm just going to try it. Like, even though I don't know anything about it, I didn't know who Bester was. Neil Gaiman actually wrote the foreword to the book. I didn't know who Neil Gaiman was at the time.
Wow.
And I mean, he's obviously, it would be ridiculous now to not know who he is, even if you're like just an 18-year-old kid just getting started. But I mean, and back then I think it was more reasonable. It was still a little ridiculous. I didn't know who he was, but I mean, this was probably 1994 or something like that. He's 94, 95, something like that. Yeah, so there's all these clues that I should have realized that, like, no, this is like a major author and this was a major book, but I didn't know. And I read it without even really realizing, I think, that it was originally published in the 50s. I don't know that I actually noticed that because it seemed like a new book. Yeah, I mean. So, I mean, the thing with Bester is that he was such a prose stylist, and I hadn't really read a book like that had that level of devotion to the style of the work, and I mean, the character was just so great and like larger than life, Gully Foyle, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just. I just never read anything like it. I mean, it pushed all my buttons with the sense of wonder, but then it also did all this great stuff in my brain as far as just the lyrical prose and everything, and so it just like added up to all this one magical sort of experience reading it. And then it's like, and then the ending just is so weird and so like unexpected, and there's all this wonderful sort of stuff where stuff that he seeds at the beginning comes back at the end and like sort of is like sort of gets brought back in like this really satisfying way. So yeah, I don't know. It just like it was like it just nailed everything for me. And it's like I mean, I think I was always really interested in sort of like dark heroes and in kind of anti-heroes, and so Gully Foyle pushed a lot of those buttons too, and so yeah, I don't know. It's yeah. I mean, actually looking back on it and knowing what I know now, that it's like okay, well, hey, it was published in the 50s, and he was like, and when you look at what's in that book, it's like he was so ahead of his time. Like, oh my God, like. I mean, I mean, first of all, just the level of prose that he was putting out at that time compared to other people who were publishing science fiction right around then. It's like, I mean, he was, head and shoulders above most people in that regard. But then also just like the ideas and everything, like so much of it feels so fresh even now. Yeah, I mean, it's like just really a visionary novel, and yeah, I mean, it still remains like my favorite book to this day. I mean, obviously, I read a lot of great books and. Including some things recently that every now and then will challenge that, and it's like it's hard when you've had a favorite for so long for anything to ever displace it. But so I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is Ka by John Crowley, which just came out. Honestly, like just stunning work. I mean, one of the best things I've ever read for sure. And it was something I had gotten submitted to me for my imprint, and I wasn't able to buy it, unfortunately. So, I mean, that's one of the downsides of working in novel publishing versus short stories. In short stories, you know, you usually get you're the only editor that submitted that story. So it's like I'm considering this exclusively. If I want to buy that story that you send me, I will buy it, and that's like the implicit agreement. But with a novel, novels sent to multiple places at the same time, and you don't always get to buy the book that you wanted to buy because somebody outbid you or whatever. There's all kinds of decisions. Sometimes you have the same bid, but then an author decides like, oh, I want to go in this direction. I liked what that editor said about it better or whatever, but you know. So yeah, and this one I wasn't able to get, unfortunately, and it's like I feel like it will haunt me to the rest of my days. Like, Ka.
Right, so we have to pause the interview there for tonight because my laptop can only upload about 20 minutes of video at once. There should be another 3 parts to this video, which I will be uploading every day this week except Thursday. So if you enjoyed this, make sure to keep tuning back in. Remember to like this video, click on the dragon to subscribe, and click here to watch the original review of Carrie Vaughan's Bannerless, published by the John Joseph Adams Imprint. I will see everyone tomorrow, and until then, read good fantasy.